Good evening, everybody. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, welcome to the Fashion Institute of Technology. My name is Julia Jaquette. I'm an artist and a professor here in the Department of Fine Arts. And together with my colleague, Jerry Zulli, who teaches in the English and Communication Studies Department, we welcome you to this presentation by the internationally famous and infamous Guerrilla Girls. A lot of people have made this evening possible, and we want to take this time to acknowledge them. The primary sponsor for tonight's event is ArtSpeak, an interdisciplinary program presented by the Departments of Fine Arts, History of Art, English and Communication Studies, and the MFA in Fashion Design. We would also like to thank Troy Richards, Dean of the School of Art and Design, and Patrick Nicely, Dean of the School of Liberal Arts, for their generous support and commitment to this program. And also to the Student Faculty Corporation for making this event possible. We thank our chairs, Joel Waring from Fine Arts, David Drogan from History of Art, Rachel Baum, Associate Chair of Art History and Museum Professions, and Amy Lemon from English and Communication Studies, and Kyle Farmer from MFA Fashion Design for their support as well.
The Guerrilla Girls are feminist activist artists. More than 55 people have been members since their founding in 1985, some for weeks, some for decades. They wear gorilla masks in public and use facts, humor, and outrageous visuals to expose gender and ethnic bias, as well as corruption in politics, art, film, and pop culture. Their anonymity keeps the focus on the issues and away from personal identity. I wanted to invite the Guerrilla Girls to FIT because of advocacy. When I was in college, I applied for a job with campus security. They had advertised for students, and was told in no uncertain terms they would not hire females. The man in charge said he knew it was against the law to discriminate, and he didn't care. I realize now that it isn't enough to say you are a feminist. Especially and increasingly in today's environment, it is critically important that we become outspoken advocates for feminism. It is in this spirit that Julia and I invited the Guerrilla Girls here.
Since the 1980s, the Guerrilla Girls have increased my awareness of the inadequate representation of women artists in the art world. Their hilarious and visually arresting posters show me how visual art can inform and do it with humor.
The Guerrilla Girls use the names of famous women artists as part of their incognito personae. Tonight we have with us Frida Kahlo, an early 20th century Mexican artist known for her remarkable self-portraits and for the recognition and celebration of women in her art, and Zubeida Agha, a Pakistani painter who spearheaded modernism in her country, known for her desire to paint ideas. What a good idea mixing art and advocacy is. And now we welcome the Guerrilla Girls.
What's very good about our image is that when you look at our masks, you think of what we stand for. And we stand for the conscience of the art world. And we feel that there is underrepresentation of women and minorities. And when you see our logo, basically, when you see our face, that's what we stand for, and it's not personal.
women artists have never gotten the serious attention and certainly not the serious money that male artists do. Why? The Guerrilla Girls, who call themselves the conscience of the art world, have plastered their answer all over town.
Coming into the city right now, probably 65% of the young artists are females, and yet less than 10% have their work shown. And that's one of the reasons I'm a Guerrilla Girl.
We believe that getting into a gallery or being shown in a museum even is for an artist an employment situation. The question was, how are you going to get women artists recognized when names, lives committed to art was completely ignored by the art history books? And so some of what we did was just attention getting.
We're anonymous do-gooders like Robin Hood, Batman, Zorro, and the Lone Ranger.
Most of the women who are doing all the bitching are completely talentless. For example, like the top women artists, you don't hear them making these embarrassing feminist pleas. I mean, it's just that these women they don't have any talent and they're taking it out on men.
If everybody who attended the Museum of Modern Art this year went up to the information desk and said, gee, where are the women artists? They'd put them on the walls.
There is a good principle that created order, light, and man, and an evil principle that created chaos, darkness, and women. Pythagoras, 6th century BC.
Girls begin to talk and stand on their feet sooner than boys because weeds grow more quickly than good crops. Martin Luther, 1533.
I consider women writers, lawyers, and politicians as monsters and nothing but five-legged calves. The woman artist is merely ridiculous, but I am in favor of the female singer and dancer, Auguste Renoir.
Dear group of communists, you're the strongest bunch of bitches ganged together I've ever seen in world of art. Don't think to career you will make it 80. Best work of art a woman can do is in bed, making well love and sometimes procreate non-idiot females. Feminism is the reason for high number of AIDS statistics in United States of America. Thanks to you, bitch feminists, if weak men become gay and AIDS raises up in USA. A woman can be a genius. Do you remember the Holy Virgin, you damn bunch of whores? Answer me if you have the courage, bunch of bitches. An early letter to the Guerrilla Girls from an Italian art critic who enclosed his calling card in the envelope.
Hello, New York. It is so great to be back in our hometown. But let's face it, guys, it's a really tough time in our country right now. We're sure that a lot of you are afraid, as we are, now that we have basically a gangster for president, and he holds the US nuclear codes. So we thought we'd start today by all letting out a collective scream together, okay? On 3. 1, 2, 3.
Speaking of which, here's a poster that we did right after the election. President Trump announces new commemorative months. We are always thinking about the struggle and the heritage of marginal groups.
But under Trump, we're afraid these months are changing. African American History Month could become Ku Klux Klan Month, LGBTQ Pride turned into Pray the Gay Away Month, Women's History into Supermodel Month.
I'm Frida Kahlo, and I'm here with my colleague, Zubaydah Aha. I'm a founding member of the Guerrilla Girls, and I've been involved in pretty much everything the group has done. And Zubaydah joined us 10 years ago.
We're a bunch of feminists who have devoted our lives to fighting for human rights for all, against the takeover of art and culture by the rich and powerful oligarchs all over the world.
Most of our work has been about discrimination and corruption in art, but we've also examined other issues in film, pop culture, gender stereotypes, and recently, income inequality. Back in 1985, we got the idea to put up 2 posters on the streets of New York. And that was about the state of marginalized artists in the New York art world. And I don't have to tell you, it wasn't a very pretty picture. But we had an idea about how to construct political art, to twist an issue around and present it in an unforgettable way and start a dialogue.
And the Guerrilla Girls were born, an anonymous bunch of artists who wear gorilla masks in public and take the name of dead women artists as pseudonyms.
As Jerry told you, over 55 individuals have been members of the Guerrilla Girls, and as she said, some for weeks and some for decades, and what she didn't say is sometimes it was only one meeting. Anyway, we've always been diverse in age, sexual orientation, social class, and from many ethnic backgrounds: South Asian, Asian, African American, Latinx, European, etc.
We've had cis and transgender members from the very beginning. We're what is called intersectional feminists, and we explore how race, class, ethnicity, and gender identity affect human rights struggles.
Who knew that our work would cause all hell to break loose? Who knew it would cause a major crisis of conscience about diversity in the art world? That was a subject at the time that museums, collectors, and critics had ignored and denied.
Now it's a no-brainer. You cannot tell the story of a culture without all the voices of the culture included in it.
But there is still a ton of bias and corruption in the art world, and because artists get all caught up in the economy of the art world, it's really hard for them to admit it openly. So that's why 35 or 33 years later, we still need these masks.
Our first 2 posters led to hundreds of others, plus street actions, billboards, stickers, and books, not just about art, but about the worlds of film, politics, and pop culture as well.
And who knew that 33 years later, we, the agitating outsiders, would actually wind up inside some of the museums we criticize, with exhibitions at MoMA, Tate Modern in London, where a whole room of ours is on display with none other than Andy Warhol, and also the Reina Sofia in Madrid.
Some of our larger scale street projects include Rotterdam, Mexico City, Istanbul, Athens, and Shanghai.
And retrospectives of our work have been held in Bilbao, Spain, Madrid. This was Bilbao, sorry. And that actually says, why are the Guerrilla Girls talking trash about art, music, politics, and pop culture? Here's our show in Madrid. And at the moment, we have a super fantastic archival show right now at MASP, the Museum of Sao Paulo in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And if you'll notice, none of these shows are in our hometown, New York. And there are lots of reasons for that we'll talk about later. But we feel that we're so lucky, I personally, to have been able to do this work. And we're so grateful to the thousands of people all over the world, aged 8 to 80, who write to us every week telling us that we inspired them to do their own crazy kind of activism.
Now, the Guerrilla Girls started out sneaking around in the middle of the night, putting up posters all over New York. Posters that revealed the truth about the discrimination in the New York art world.
We did it because we were pissed off. And suddenly the posters caught everyone's attention, and everyone started to talk about the issues in the poster.
And this is an example of how bad things were. We weren't complaining because there weren't 50% this or 13% that. We were complaining about 0010.
And it was even harder for women artists of color. So we did this very early intersectional poster, before that word was even, thrown around. Only 4 commercial galleries in New York show black women. Only one shows more than one. And of course that brings up the issue of tokenism, which we'll talk about in a little while.
But soon the word on the street was that the Guerrilla Girls were a bunch of whining complainers. So negative. We took this criticism to heart and decided to do a poster to help women artists be more positive about their situation.
The advantages of being a woman artist.
Working without the pressure of success.
Not being stuck in a tenured teaching position.
Being included in revised versions of art history.
Having more time to work after your mate dumps you for someone younger.
Not having to undergo the embarrassment of being considered a genius.
Getting your picture in the art magazines wearing a gorilla mask. Now, this poster has been translated into many languages, and hardly a week goes by that we don't get letters from people in fields as diverse as veterinary science, music, physics, cartooning. We even got a letter from someone studying to be a mortician, telling us that this poster isn't just about the art world, it's the story of their lives too.
A few years later, we were invited to do a billboard in Manhattan and decided to try out this crazy voice we'd developed on a larger audience.
So one Sunday morning, we went to the Metropolitan Museum to conduct what we affectionately came to call the weenie count. Anyone know what the weenie count was? We counted naked males and naked females in the artworks just to see what they might tell us.
When we went through the classical art section, most of the naked figures were male. When we toured the early Christian sections, there wasn't any flesh at all. In the Renaissance and Baroque paintings, the only fully frontal naked figure we could find belonged to the baby Jesus.
It was only after we arrived in the 19th and 20th century galleries, the sort of early modern era, when sex replaced religion as the major preoccupation of European artists, did we find our statistics. And here's what we did with it. Do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art section are women, but 85% of the nudes are female.
Now, we'd love to think that our work has made a huge difference in the art world, but old habits die hard, and some museums are still lagging behind.
We went back to the Met a few years ago just to see if anything had gotten better. We were sure that it had to have. And here's what we found.
Fewer women artists, but more naked men. Progress?
In the mid-1990s, the buzzword in the US art world had become multiculturalism. Art institutions everywhere were playing catch-up, showing 1 or 2 artists from each of the marginalized groups that they had previously discriminated against.
But instead of showing the great diversity of artists from these groups, most museums were showing the same few artists over and over again.
So we decided it was time to do a campaign about tokenism, applying intersectional theory to the art world and asking the question, is tokenism a solution or merely a continuation of the problem of exclusion?
Top 10 signs you're an art world token. Every one of these things has happened to members of our group.
Your busiest months are February, Black History Month, March, Women's History Month, April, American Awareness, September, Latino Heritage, October, LGBTQ History and Disability Awareness Month, and November, Native American History Month.
At parties and openings, the only other people of color are serving the drinks.
Whenever you open your mouth, it's assumed you speak for your people, not just yourself.
Everyone ends up telling you their interracial, gay, and transgender sexual fantasies.
And a museum that won't exhibit your work gives you a prominent place in its lecture series. That happened to us so many times.
Now, recently, the Guerrilla Girls have been busier than ever, and we've been faced with a huge dilemma. What do you do when the system you have spent your whole life attacking embraces you? In 2005, we were asked to do a large-scale installation at the Venice Biennale, and now our work is exhibited at major museums all over the world.
So what's a girl activist to do? Well, we agonize over it all the time. We can closely consider, the invitations, we fight, we argue back and forth, and we try to find situations where we don't feel compromised. And in the end, we've made the decision to participate in exhibitions and appearances at museums because, of course, we want to get our message out to as large an audience as possible.
And it's a thrill to criticize art institutions right on their own walls.
So here is what we did in Venice, an installation of 6 17-foot-high posters that were the very first things that you could see in the main exhibition hall of the Arsenale.
We took on the Biennale itself, documenting 110 years of discrimination, but we also declared it the first feminist Biennale. Why? Because it had the first women directors ever, and, surprise, the highest number of women artists ever.
And we also decided to take on the historic museums of Venice, because we discovered that every historic museum in Venice, except one, did have work by women artists in their collection. But instead of hanging it in the galleries, it was all kept in the basements.
We appropriated this iconic image of Marcello Mastroianni straddling Anita Ekberg from the famous Fellini film La Dolce Vita and asked the question, where are the women artists of Venice? The answer, underneath the men.
So then at the bottom, we demanded that viewers go to the museums of Venice and tell them that they needed to see more women on top.
A couple of years later, the Washington Post, a major US newspaper, gave us a full page as part of a special section on feminism and art. We designed our own tabloid, Not Okay, the Guerrilla Girls scandal rag, to reveal the shocking truth about the low number of women and artists of color in the US's national art museums.
Horror on the National Mall. Thousands of women locked in basements of DC museums. Why does macho art world keep female artists out of sight?
Now, we got all of our statistics from this project from the museums themselves or from their websites. But when the Post called to fact check, they all went bananas.
And the National Gallery said, call us back tomorrow. And overnight, they hurriedly installed a Martin Puryear sculpture so they could have at least one African-American artist on exhibit at the National Gallery at that point. Only one. And the Hirshhorn suddenly found works by women it never knew it owned.
By the way, this is how bad things were at our taxpayer-supported museums. The National Gallery of Art, 98% male, 99.9% white. They had only one work by an African American in the entire museum, the one they installed the day after the phone call.
Now, lots of museums have the names of dead white artists inscribed on their facades. And we've always wondered if maybe that isn't part of the problem.
So we came up with a solution, replacing names like Leonardo and Michelangelo with artists like Artemisia Gentileschi, Frida Kahlo, Rosa Bonheur, Alma Thomas, and Claude Cahun.
Now, speaking of Claude Cahun, we actually wrote about Claude Cahun in our bedside companion to the history of Western art. Now, Claude Cahun lived in France in the mid-20th century and made self-portraits in all manners of gender roles.
Claude was born Lucy Schwab. Claude's life partner and step-sibling, Susan Malherbe, also renamed himself, becoming Marcel. Some books on surrealism list Claude as a man, others as a woman. The Guerrilla Girls think the art history needs some new vocabulary to describe artists like Claude Cahun.
Now, please don't get the idea that we don't like art. We love art. We love artists. But let's face it, while there are lots of people in the art world who really care about art, there are also lots of poseurs, snobs, gamblers, tax dodgers, inside traders, and quite a few criminals. The art market is entirely unregulated. In fact, it has been described as the fourth largest black market in the world. And that's after drugs, guns, and diamonds.
So we made a version of History of Art Museums. And this is taken from the Guerrilla Girls Art Museum Activity Book.
A brief history of museums. It all began because rich people have always had a lot of stuff. When kings and queens and emperors and aristocrats ran out of space in their palaces and churches, well, they needed somewhere to store it all.
Bingo! They started art museums.
In many countries, museums are part of the government and are run by bureaucrats and civil servants. But in the United States, most museums are funded and overseen by super wealthy art collectors, the 1% of the 1%. Now, books, music, and film are really cheap. They can be owned by literally everyone. But art is a little bit different. It's very expensive, and only the super rich can buy it. And once collectors spend all that money on their artwork, well, they want to have their huge investments appreciate in value, which is basically what happens when the work is shown in museums.
U.S. museums receive so little public funding, they survive on donations from these rich collectors. In turn, these collectors get to serve on museum boards. They get huge tax deductions, and in turn, they can influence what the museum will show and collect.
Now, it doesn't take a genius to realize that this system is ripe for corruption. In other fields, this kind of insider trading and conflicts of interests are illegal. But no one mentions this in the art world. It's late capitalism at its finest.
Okay, let's take a short quiz. Of the top 100 art auction sales from 2011 to 2016, how many were women artists? Just shout out an answer.
1.
What does art by famous females cost compared to famous males?
16%.
The highest sale ever for a living female artist, $9.7 million for a Katie Noland, is only 16.6% of the highest sale for a living male artist, $58.4 million for a Jeff Koons.
Can you make money from a museum while you're on its board of directors?
What do you think? Yes! $11 million says yes.
That's what Count Giuseppe Panza was paid for selling part of his art collection to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles while he was on the board of directors. He sold other work from his collection to the Guggenheim that very year for $30 million. So maybe he gave, Mass Mocha a discount.
What's one of the economic forces behind the new Guggenheim Museum in Abu Dhabi?
Debt bondage. Foreign workers at the Guggenheim and in the surrounding luxury zone are hired from South Asia and flown to the Emirates. When they arrive, their passports are confiscated and their pay turns out to be nothing like what they were promised. They're forced to live in inhumane conditions like this and to work for a pittance.
Last question. What's more important to the Metropolitan Museum of Art than free speech? Everyone got it.
They're getting good. You know, the Met recently accepted $65 million from the ultra-right-wing Koch brothers, oligarchs who spend even more than that trying to undermine US elections.
Now, what did the Met do after getting the Koch's dirty money? They held a big party to celebrate them and then called the cops in to arrest a group of artists who protested outside by projecting this image onto the museum, tagging the Kochs as climate deniers.
Now, speaking of billionaires in the art world, here's a stealth campaign that we did in New York 3 years ago. We put up stickers about income inequality going after art collectors, art galleries, and museums.
We also did a surprise, uninvited projection on the new Whitney Museum with the help of the Illuminator Collective the day the building was first opened.
So the world of artists is great, but the art world sucks. The super rich are controlling the museums, sitting on the boards.
Power is being centralized into these few rich people. Like, it's really about the 1%.
Unfortunately, the art world right now appears to be about money and about the production of luxury items.
Billionaires are making more and more and more, and their taste controls which artists get the big bucks and get the opportunities and get the shows. We're planning to sneak around New York with the Illuminator. So we'll be starting out in Chelsea, and we hope to then go to the Whitney. So we had this idea to do something we could do really fast around New York and put these stickers up. Some of the stickers are about art galleries, about billionaires, billionaire collectors, and about museums. So we wanted to put them up where they belong, on the big galleries, on the museums, and give them out to people, especially so they could do the same thing. And it seemed like a great idea. Call people together, just put the word out, see who comes, and just run around the streets and put these things up and bother people.
It's going to be a Saturday in Chelsea. People walking around feeling really good about having seen all this inspiring art, and all of a sudden they're going to see the wall above start talking to them. And it's going to say, "Dear art collector." We completely get it. Collecting art is so expensive. We really understand why you can't afford to pay all your employees a living wage. The wall is going to talk to them. Every time we put something up, you know, people would go bananas. Some people would love it, some people would hate it. So we would sort of work in that space. It's really very productive to provoke people to think about things. And we discovered early on that if you could make someone who disagreed with you laugh, you know, you had a hook inside their brain. You know, once you were in there, you just might be able to change their minds about things.
Now, there are collectors and donors who advocate for a different art world and collect work by diverse artists. But today, there are so many collectors who use art as an investment and have the same cookie-cutter collections as all their other rich friends. Then they create their own museums and foundations to skim off corporate profits so they can buy more art and get huge tax deductions when the work goes inside their own museums. And they have total control over this cultural institution.
Now here's a banner that we did outside a formerly private museum in Cologne, the Museum Ludwig. This, of course, is in German, because we had to do it in German there, but here it is in English.
The advantages of owning your own art museum.
You're the boss. You call the shots, just like in your own business.
You decide what art the museum collects and exhibits under the influence, of course, of the multinational galleries and auction houses who manipulate and define today's art market.
At fancy parties, art fairs, and biennials, everybody sucks up to you.
And your wallet.
Your huge donations get you huge tax breaks, all the while people think you're an incredibly generous philanthropist.
And if you make the mistake of hiring progressive, inclusive directors, curators, and staff, you can just be like Donald Trump and say, "You're fired."
You know, we took sticker versions of this banner to Frieze Art Fair in London the fall of 2016, and we tried to pass them out, and we were immediately busted. But of course, we got lots of great press.
But it made us wonder, what about this message was so scary to the art fair?
And as you can see, we think a lot about museums. And in 2016, we opened 2 projects in London almost simultaneously. And at the Whitechapel Gallery, we decided to find out what museums think about themselves.
We sent out 383 questionnaires to art institutions all over Europe and the UK, and made a show from the 101 responses we received.
And as for the 282 that didn't respond, well, we didn't leave them out of the show. We put their names on the floor where everyone could walk on them.
And here's a bit of what we found out.
Only 2 of the responding institutions have more than 40% women artists in their collection.
A Finnish museum told us that women artists have been hugely important to them since 1861.
But today, their collection only has 12% women.
The Reina Sofia claims they think about diversity all the time.
But their collection is still 87% male.
Billionaire art collector Dakis Yanyu told us that gender and race aren't important at his private museum. The only thing that matters is pure talent.
So in the exhibition, we asked him, "What planet do you live on?"
We ended this show with this statement: don't let museums reduce art to the small number of artists who have won a popularity contest among big-time dealers, curators, and collectors.
Unless museums show art as diverse as the cultures they claim to represent, they're not showing the history of art, they're just preserving the history of wealth and power.
At the Tate Modern, at the same time as the Whitechapel exhibition, we created the first ever Guerrilla Girls complaints department. Thousands of people came to complain about art, gender issues, racism, politics, and the museum itself.
Our complaints department traveled to Brazil last fall, and it was great. And we would love to install it either somewhere here in New York or maybe on the Mall in Washington, D.C.
And we're actually just back from Hong Kong, where the Asia Art Archive invited us to critique Art Basel Hong Kong, the art fair, one of the biggest art fairs in the world. And we did it right on their walls.
So we took a quote from Confucius, and then we created a participatory installation where we invited visitors to go to the fair and do their own gender count and come back and report it to us.
We also collected a bunch of statistics about Hong Kong itself. Almost everywhere we go, the majority, and this includes FIT, the majority of art students are women. But most professional opportunities and most of the money overwhelmingly goes to the same demographic, white male artists.
Okay, you're probably tired of, talking about the art world. It's really depressing. So why don't we cut to another area of US culture that's even worse than the art world? Hollywood.
The film industry loves to think of itself as edgy and progressive and ahead of the curve. But if you look behind the scenes at writers, directors, editors, you'll find almost all of them are white men.
So for several years, we rented billboards in Hollywood, just a few blocks from where the Academy Awards were held. And for our first one, in 2002, we decided it was time to put a little realism into the Golden Boy.
We redesigned the Golden Boy to look more like the guys who take him home. The anatomically correct Oscar. He's white and male, just like the guys who win.
Now, we had to back up this outrageous statement with the facts. And at that time, no woman had ever won Best Director. 94% of the writing awards had gone to men, and only 3% of the acting awards had been given to actors of color.
That was the very year that both Denzel Washington and Halle Berry won Oscars for their performances.
And we are convinced it was because of our billboard.
A few years later, Monique, Octavia Spencer, and Lupita Nyong'o became the 5th, 6th, and 7th Black women in 86 years to win Oscars for acting. Jeffrey Fletcher and John Ridley became the first Black men to win for screenwriting, and Kathryn Bigelow became the first woman to win Best Director and only the 4th ever to be nominated. And this year, Jordan Peele won an Oscar for writing Get Out.
And of course, we'll take credit for that too.
And last year, 14 years after our first campaign, in the midst of the Oscar So White scandal in the US, we updated 3 of our anti-Hollywood billboards in Minneapolis.
Here's the US Senate is more progressive than Hollywood, Unchain the women directors, and an update of Anatomically Correct. But now, let's go on to the music industry.
A couple of years ago, Pharrell Williams invited us to be in a show in Paris about femininity. And we did a new poster for it, including this version of our best-known poster.
Do women have to be naked to get into music videos? While 99% of the guys are dressed, we decided we would just repurpose one of our old posters.
We've also done lots of posters about political and social issues.
In 2009, we did a poster about hatred of and violence against females that appeared on the streets of Montreal on the 20th anniversary of the worst mass murder ever in Canada, when a gunman, claiming he was fighting feminism, entered the École Polytechnique in Montreal, separated the women from the men, and shot and killed 14 women who were studying engineering.
Our poster is a graffiti wall of sexist hate speech throughout the centuries, including Confucius, who said 100 women are not worth a single testicle,
and Pat Robertson, who said feminism is a socialist anti-family movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians.
Worst of all. And it struck us that it's still okay to publicly say these things about women and trans women that wouldn't be tolerated if they were said about other groups.
Case in point, our beloved President Donald Trump, who brags about grabbing pussy and abuses women continually.
Close to half of all women and many men and trans people have been sexually harassed and or abused in the workplace.
And guys in power do this over and over again, and then other guys in power look the other way and let them get away with it.
Over and over again. But now, so many of us are speaking out, and we're telling our stories. We're saying, me too.
And all together, time's up.
A few years ago, the Guerrilla Girls gave our first ever commencement address at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in front of 4,000 cheering students and a few angry parents. And this has sort of become our manifesto. It's the Guerrilla Girls' Guide to Behaving Badly, which you have to do most of the time in the world as we know it.
So we made a video version of our rant and our call to action, and we're going to end our presentation tonight by playing it for you. Here it is. The Guerrilla Girls' Guide to Behaving Badly, which you have to do most of the time in the world as we know it.
Be a loser. The world of art doesn't have to be an Olympics where a few win and everyone else is forgotten. The art market and its hyper-competitive celebrity culture makes everyone but the stars feel like failures. But there's another world out there that's not about raging egos, a world of artistic cooperation and collaboration. That's the one we joined, and we invite you to join it too. Let's make trouble together.
Be crazy. Political art or activism that points to something and says this is bad is just preaching to the converted. Instead, try to change people's minds and do it in some unforgettable way. A trick we learned is humor helps you fly under the radar. If you can get people who disagree with you to laugh at an issue, you have a hook right into their brain. Once there, you have a much better chance to convert them.
Be anonymous. Sometimes you gotta speak out publicly, but sometimes it works even better to speak out anonymously. Now this has its disadvantages, like working your whole life without getting any credit, but it has lots of advantages too. Our anonymity, for example, keeps the focus on the issues and away from our personalities. The mystery of who we might be draws lots of attention to the issues we promote. Plus, you won't believe what comes out of your mouth while wearing a gorilla mask.
Be an outsider. Even if you're working inside the system, we say act like an outsider. Seek out the understory, the subtext, the overlooked, and the downright unfair. Then expose it. Jam your culture. Remake your institution.
Just do one thing. If it works, do another. If it doesn't, do another anyway. Don't be paralyzed if you don't get it right every time. Just keep chipping away. We promise that bit by bit, your efforts will add up to something effective.
Artists, don't make only expensive art that billionaire art collectors can afford. Curators, don't exhibit only the expensive art your trustees donate. Let's have more cheap art that everyone can own, like books, zines, music, and movies, like our posters.
Show museums tough love. It's unethical that wealthy art collectors who invest lots of money in art can become museum trustees overseeing institutions that in turn validate their investments. It's a lousy way to write and preserve our history.
Demand ethical standards inside museums. No more conflicts of interest or insider trading. No more cookie-cutter collections of art that cost the most. Convince art collectors their collections are inferior with only work by white male artists. Don't let museums perpetuate this version of art and power with a few tokens thrown in. Make sure your favorite museum casts a wider net and collects the whole story of our culture.
Whether you work in a museum or a classroom, don't teach an art history constructed by corrupt institutions. Do like we did. Write your own.
Complain, complain, complain. Be a creative complainer. Be a professional complainer. Don't assume people know what's missing from museums. Remind them how many modern and contemporary art collections still contain less than 15% females and artists of color.
Use the F word. Feminism. We think it's crazy that so many people who believe in the tenets of feminism are still afraid to call themselves feminists. Feminism doesn't get the respect it deserves. Women's rights, civil rights, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights, and Black Lives Matter are the great human rights movements of our times.
Feminists like us who believe in intersectionality fight for all human rights. No one is free until everyone is free.
Feminism is changing the world. It's revolutionizing human thought, giving many people lives their great-grandparents could never have imagined. But there's still so much work to do. There are so many countries worldwide where LGBTQ people and women have little or no human rights.
90% of transgender employees have faced discrimination or harassment at work. In the US, no federal law protects them, even though nearly 80% of voters support such a law. Then there's rampant sexism in the tech industry, including the harassment of female gamers. And what about the gender earning gap that the US Congress refuses to move against?
Violence and abuse against women, gay, and transgender people is still a huge international problem. From gang rape in India to kidnappings in Nigeria to sexual slavery by ISIS to the negligible punishment treatment given out for domestic violence in America. Trans women are assaulted and even murdered in the U.S.
But despite all this bad news, feminist resistance movements are exploding all over the world. Let's make the F-word feminism the F-word for the future. Let's all join together with feminists on the right side of history. Well, if we could bring up the lights, now it's your turn to complain, to rant, to ask questions, whatever you like. Do we need to have a mic? Great. Here's the mic runner. His name is Mike.
Is it on? Oh, hello.
Hey, you're going to get a pop quiz tomorrow on the questions and answers.
Wonderful.
No, teasing.
I've got two questions for you. The first is you talked about like the light projection on the Whitney in response to their discriminatory policies for which types of artists they're putting in their galleries. How does it feel having your work in their newest exhibition on protest? That's my first question. And my second one is, what is your take on the protests currently at the Brooklyn Museum about neo-colonialism in their curatorial staff? Thank you so much. You guys rock.
Do you want to do the first one?
Yeah, well, the first one, we are very rude dinner guests. So we love complaining about a museum right inside that museum. And, you know, to be honest, we were pleasantly surprised that the Whitney included those posters because they picked the posters in which we're criticizing them alongside a lot of the other ones. So we're like, yeah, that's good. You're being self-critical.
I think we've discovered that there are good-intentioned people working inside the institutions, and they're usually the ones who contact us, and we kind of work with them. And maybe it's easier for us to make trouble and then, you know, let them deal with it afterwards. As for the decolonize this and the anti-gentrification movements at the Brooklyn Museum, we completely support them. I think it's time, you know, for museums to rethink their role fundamentally and think of themselves as institutions of living culture, not the history of colonialism. Hold on, we can't hear you. Just a minute. You're going to get that mic.
So not only are there a lot of male artists in museum, a lot of those male artists are misogynist males. And can we pick them out? All these nude women from the brothel, etc.
Yeah, I find it so hilarious when people are like, well, if we get rid of all the artists who were bad, then we'll have nothing in our museums. And I'm like, really? Are we running out of artists? No, we're not. We're just getting rid of the jerks. So I am wholly behind it.
I mean, all they really need are labels, and I think a few artists have like canceled their shows because they don't want nasty labels next to their work. So that's kind of eliminating. There are some artists who have removed have canceled their exhibitions because they don't want labels next to their work talking about how they assaulted their assistants. So that's an interesting kind of way of as they say, pulling out.
I'm glad to see you guys in person. I grew up in the 90s, and your artwork, or I should say your messages, stood right next to party flyers and all of the other tidbits of the visual ecology of New York. But my question is, so were you guys the only animals in the jungle? Were there other allies that were on the scene doing similar things either inside or outside of the cultural world here in New York that you allied with?
You know, there have always been allies, and there are a lot more now, thankfully, because the conversation has changed a lot. But we we feel so lucky to be part of the activist community that we're part of, and it really is a community. And if anyone out here is also an activist, one of the most important things you can do is be a good ally. And being a good ally means showing up for stuff when it's not your cause. Like, you have to show up for marches that aren't only about the stuff you're protesting about. So we've always really survived thanks to our allies.
Could I ask the historical, or answer the historical part of that? There were lots of groups doing what we were doing. And if you go to the show at the Whitney right now, they were actually pretty good about that. You know, but I think we were lucky to be at a moment when there was street art, when the art world was, you know, just exploding. And also we had the internet on our side. And the internet was really helpful to take our message outside of, I mean, we started putting up posters in Soho, and that was very limited. And within a few years, you know, maybe 10 years, you know, there was the internet, and our message went all over the world. Everything we did could be reproduced. We did Xeroxes, we passed things out. And I also have to say, from very early on, educational institutions really helped us spread our message. We started to go to schools from the very first year we put up posters. So we weren't the only animals in the jungle, not at all. And there are lots of, you know, unsung activists, who really need to be part of that history.
I love the way you phrase that. We're really only animals in the jungle. Great.
You mentioned education, and I think that's a really important thing in terms of getting people involved in art. But unfortunately, at least in my experience, all of my art history professors have been white women, and all of my coworkers at museums have been also white women, and the men on top are white. So what kind of solutions or what advice do you have for young women of color who want to get into the industry and maybe like the feminist rhetoric isn't as welcoming to them when it's kind of only spoken from a white woman's perspective?
You know, the way I navigated that personally is I found a women of color activist group, art activist group that I joined. And not only was it, you know, like a great network, but it was really sort of an emotional space where we could talk about this and all the solutions that people have come up with. And now when I find myself in a position where I have a little bit more power, I'm very careful. And for me, it really boils down to, I think the biggest problem with diversity in the art world boils down to the money. So much of the art world, to get a job, you need to intern for free for somewhere for 2 years. And who can afford to do that? And I had to find my community, but now I have to be super conscious of how I make sure that I don't perpetuate the same issues.
I would say this is your moment. It's really your moment. You know, the art world needs you, and you're the one who can really help it, and you have to keep that in mind. You are the future.
I have a couple of questions. Is this on? Is this working? I have two questions, actually. The first question is, were you ever at a protest where you felt threatened, physically concerned? And my second question is, you've given us lots of protesting to do, but what about, is there any particular venue you feel we should celebrate? You had success stories from Hollywood. Do you have some gallery or museum success stories that we may, to not just protest against the ones who are not listening, but maybe to celebrate those who are?
You know, it's so much more fun to complain. We don't give out gold stars. You know, I feel like as soon as we do, people get complacent. But like we said earlier, they're allies in every institution. Every institution that invites us, that's because there's an ally inside who wants to bring our message in there. So there's people everywhere. I forgot your first question.
Oh, have we ever been at a dangerous protest? Oh yes, I'm very familiar with the smell of tear gas. Yeah, I was tear gassed in Washington several times. Very close to the Justice Department, as I recall.
So I know the Guerrilla Girls say they want to change what feminism means. So what would you like feminism to mean?
I think we want We want feminism to mean intersectional feminism. You know, for us, we're not interested in the conversation unless it's also addressing all the other factors, and then the experience is different for different women. So we're very adamant, it has to be intersectional.
Hi guys, thanks for your presentation, it was amazing. I grew up in the art world. I'm an art gallerist, and I'm a second generation art gallerist, minority female. And the way that I've seen the industry evolve is that most gallerists are going to art fairs and closing down their retail spaces. Now, in order for us to get into an art fair, we have to apply and get accepted. So what can we do, you know, all of us as consumers and us as gallerists to help further your cause? Because even at these fairs, you know, there's largely one race and there's largely one.
You know, there's a systemic problem in the art world, and it's a problem of capitalism, whereas all the profit goes to the top and it's based on the exploitation, you know, at the bottom, and there's nothing in between except, you know, maybe if you teach in the art world. I think that structure has to change. And as long as, you know, art and art galleries and art dealers have to run after rich people, it's not going to change. I mean, that's what it is. We have a different kind of model. We sell posters, we sell books, we do talks like this. I think artists have to find other ways to live and not participate in that system, because that system is a sinking ship in terms of producing culture. You know, I think there are other ways to do it, and we've got to look around. I don't have all the answers. All I know is what we did. And I'm kind of proud of the fact that we don't have, you know, we don't have collectors, we don't have galleries. We have people like you. And I think that artists should think about that. Maybe you could figure out a way for your artists to become productive in other ways than going to art fairs and trying to win that lottery.
Yeah, I mean, it really is sort of, the whole ecosystem is threatened at this point. And especially with the art fairs, when we were in Art Basel, Hong Kong, we showed the statistics for what was shown at Art Basel, Hong Kong the year before, and I should know these off the top of my head. Was it 75% of all artists that were shown were male? Or no, I think it was only 16% that were shown were women. It was
shocking.
It was like a horrible percentage, and the people who run the art fair walked by and they were like, oh, that's not correct, that's not correct. And we're like, we actually got the numbers from your site. And then they were like, oh, but you know, that's what the galleries apply with. But it's like, but that's what you're accepting. So you're not pushing the fact that so many galleries are coming with almost zero women artists. The majority of the galleries at Art Basel Hong Kong showed zero women artists.
And it was also a great place for money laundering. I mean, people came into the fair with suitcases of cash. Art can be a criminal activity. There's a lot of money laundering going on. There's a lot of, criminal stuff going on. And I think that we really need to figure out how to make an alternative system.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not easy and it's probably messy, but, why not? What could be worse?
Hi. So my question, I have two questions. One is, I find your being anonymous to be amazing, and I wonder if it's a struggle for you to not be able to share that with some of the people in your lives, and how you deal with that. And my other question is, how do I become a Guerrilla Girl? I know there's people in here who, they know me, so you don't have to tell them or whatever, but I just really want to know how I could be part of your cause, and I would love to just join you guys on the street sometime.
To answer your first question, there's so much lying involved, so many lies. Like friends are like, do you want to go out for dinner tonight? And I'm like, no, I can't. I got this thing and I can't tell you about it.
And I'll be back in a week.
It is really tricky navigating the anonymity. And, I'm going to be realistic. We do so much work and we can't really talk to people about it. And sometimes that's hard. But the anonymity is really important to who we are. And can I answer the second one too? I feel like I'm hogging the
Yeah,
mic.
go ahead. Sure. I get the next one.
Becoming a guerrilla girl, we get asked that a lot. And, you know, we really wish we could take everybody in because we would love to. But the reality of being a guerrilla girl or being any artist collective, it's a lot of hard work, a lot of getting together and arguing about the punctuation on a poster or the typeface or like really, really mundane things. And that stuff you can't do with a group of like 100 women, you know? So to produce work as a collective, you have to sort of be a nimble, tight group. But the good news is, the world doesn't need more guerrilla girls. What the world needs is more feminist activists. So form your own anonymous feminist activist group. Wouldn't that be scary?
Oh, hi. Is it okay that I have the mic? Okay. So I am from Philly and I do comedy, and one of the issues in the scene is that a lot of women will anonymously comment that, you know, the stand-up material is like not always the most progressive or politically correct and whatever, and as a result, they don't feel safe in those spaces and then don't go to those mics. And then at the same time, you have more women who are more seasoned who are at those mics, but then they get affected because there's less women at the, you know, like in the event. And so I guess I wonder, how do you grapple with that? Because there's so many times where I want to just say that more women should just come to infiltrate the scene, right, and change that whole demographic. But at the same time, I want to respect people's personal experiences, and I don't want to invalidate what they say or claim that something is safe when it's not safe to them. Yeah.
Well, I don't know how to answer that because I don't know stand-up, but I have to say Michelle Wolf did a really great job on Saturday night. I mean, it went out to everybody, like, you know, on the floor saying, is that disgusting or is it wonderful? You know? I don't know what to say. I mean, anonymity allows you to speak your mind. And, you know, it's a long history of anonymity in our political world and also in our cultural world. We've always had anonymous writers. We had anonymous broadsheets during, you know, the Revolutionary War. There were anonymous raids that were sort of not so politically correct. But so I kind of revel in it. And I enjoy it, and it gives me two personas. You know, one day I can be Frida, and the other days I can be myself. My dog knows who I am, no matter what. But I don't know what to say about female, you know, comedians, except that that's a voice that the world really needs, and they say unforgettable, you know, things. I guess if you're not willing to, I don't know, put yourself on the line, it's hard to have an effect. But, you know, friends are helpful. Why not have a handler or a protector?
But I also, like, if somebody doesn't feel that one space that's sort of an established space, they don't feel welcome there or they don't feel comfortable there. And if there's enough women who share that sentiment, like, why not have our own space? You know, why do we need to keep going back to that space? Why don't we create our own space?
Hi, thanks for coming and talking to us. I wanted to ask about how we can convince more women to call themselves feminist when in a time where facts and statistics aren't really being believed, which is like obviously a lot of what you guys do. When we can't rely on that information, what other techniques can we use to get people to take on that feminist label?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I don't think that facts have become irrelevant. I think that we're giving a small minority far too much attention just because they scream and shout and they do outrageous things. I think we need to think past that And what I'd like to see is more men identify with feminism. I'd like to actually do a gig where half the audience was male. And, I don't think we've ever done that, except we did do a presentation once at an all-male school in Indiana. And they said, please help us. You can't believe what an awful place this is. You wouldn't believe the dormitories are like locker rooms. Anyway, I think that that's important. Talk to your male friends. Tell them that it's their issues too, that we can take some of the pressure off of them, by giving us a fair shake.
But also, what's worked for us, and what the Guerrilla Girls were so genius in when they started, it's humor. Like, a lot of times when someone doesn't agree with you, you're not going to convert them by throwing more facts and arguments at them. We found that if you say something funny, it kind of sticks in their brain and kind of eats away at them a little bit. And once you have that, it's not long before people start, shifting the way they're thinking. So we also, yes, we have to keep showing facts, but we also just can't keep saying this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. We have to be more creative in how we talk.
I want to ask a question.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I lived in Soho, and so through the 80s and 90s, I saw your posters and, very much enjoyed them and pointed them out to my two daughters. I want to point to the issue of cheap art. Part of what makes art valuable is that it's often unique. There's a single piece of whatever it is that artist has created. So to get at your point of cheap art, making art more accessible to everyone in this room and beyond, how do we do that and still make sure that artists have a living wage and are earning enough income that they can keep on producing that cheap art?
Well, there's lots of kinds of art that you can make. You don't have to make a precious object that can exist in one place at one time. That's what sort of turns it into a commodity. But if you look into the history of the 19th century, artists were always making prints of their works. They made copies of their works. There was a very, entrepreneurial, market around the art world that wasn't just about producing one masterpiece that, that all the 10 billionaires in the world want to own. So I think we haven't thought about all the different ways of doing it. I mean, think about literature, about film. They're expensive to make, but they're accessible to everyone. What I find creepy is this idea that they're going to put a Freeport up at Huntington Market where you can park art. You can buy art for a lot of money. You don't want to pay sales tax on it. You don't want to pay usage tax on it. You stick it in the Freeport. No one ever sees it until you decide to sell it for $3 billion. That's really annoying that art can be owned, it can be controlled, and it can be withheld. How can that really be culture? Can you imagine if someone, bought the rights to a novel, to Lolita, and then refused to have it published? I mean, we have to fight against that.
But I also think it's happening already. Right now the Frieze Art Fair is taking place. If you go there, it's super boring. Every fall, there's the Printed Matter book fair, artist book fair that happens at MoMA PS1. Go to that fair. It's all artists selling cheap art, and it's the most crowded, enthusiastic, amazing fair. And every year, we're there every year, and we get asked to participate in fairs all over the world, but we go to the Printed Matter book fair because we're selling stuff for $20 and everyone else there is selling stuff for $20. So young artists are already rejecting the whole make one precious painting that's going to last you, 2 years of your living expenses, because truthfully, that's failing everybody. Only 1% of the art world can survive on that. Most people can survive by selling a lot of cheap art. That's how we've survived. We sell $20 posters.
Okay. Well, out of curiosity, earlier you said you were contacted by Pharrell Williams at some point. Was that before or after Blurred Lines?
I'm sorry, what was the question about Pharrell Williams?
Yeah, was that before or after Blurred Lines?
Oh, it was after.
Okay, and do you think that was his way of being I can remedy that?
Yeah.
Contacting you guys?
It was his penance. He was doing his penance.
And
By
that's
doing-
why the image that we used, that was an image of the model from Blurred Lines. We're going to keep reminding him of that video that he made.
And we really wanted it to look like we did it in 5 minutes. But actually, I had to watch a lot of disgusting music videos to come up with that statistic.
Hi. So my question is that, not that like you probably did it on purpose, but a lot of the talk was obviously about men and women and including trans people, but where is there a place for people who don't really identify as either and kind of find themselves either non-conforming or leaning towards one but not entirely? Like, how do they find a place in that world while dealing with binary but also not taking away from other issues but still having themselves be heard and finding a place in that world that kind of splits everything into two?
You know, that's a tough question, and the truth is, it's harder. It's much harder, and I wish we had an answer, but we don't. But I think what you're doing is perfect. You have to keep reminding people that there's more than just the binary, you know?
I know this is hard, to believe, but this is the best time in history to be non-binary. It's as good as it's ever been, and maybe you should run with it. Anyway, could we have maybe one more question? Yeah, sure.
Okay, hi. I'm a first year at a school that has a very white male-driven art and music scene, and sometimes I feel like my inclusion in these spaces isn't really enough. And you guys did that poster about the naked bodies versus female artists in the museum, in the Met Museum, and you updated it, and there still wasn't that much progress. So I guess my question is, how do you stay motivated when you're not seeing that much change or progress being made?
You know, we're not seeing the change we want in statistics, but the conversation has totally changed. When the Guerrilla Girls started in 1985 and they said that women and artists of color weren't getting equal opportunities, the response they got was, oh, they're not making work that's good enough. If they were making work that's good enough, they would be at the top because this is a pure meritocracy. No one says that now. Everyone understands that there are systemic obstacles. So when we get really depressed about the facts, we have to go back to the fact that at least the conversation has changed. At least people aren't saying crap like that to us anymore. And it takes a long time to turn a big ship around. So it's going to take a while, and we're going to get 2 steps forward, 2 steps back all the time. But it's improving.
One more, maybe? Can I ask one more? Is that okay?
Who has the mic? I have no idea.
I have the mic, sorry. My question is about not making precious objects. I don't make precious objects. I'm a performance interventionist. But let's say I'm a ceramicist. So am I gonna watch as people get compensated for like finance jobs, marketing, etc., while I'm working on my precious object and having to be a waitress? I'm just wondering how we can improve the system, and I think it's like just a larger thing as a whole, like it's all kind of screwed. But if we're not going to compensate artists for the work that they do, precious object, intervention, or whatever, how can we still justify compensating people for work I personally find less of value, but that's not really the point. I don't know.
I think that making art is its own reward, and we have to find joy in that and figure it all out and be survivors and to tell the rest of the world, it doesn't matter. And maybe going back to the last question, what really annoys me is the word empowerment. Everyone wanting to empower women, empower marginalized groups, people of color. We are empowered. It's the system that's the problem. It's not us. And I think we have to keep that in mind. Okay. Did you have one more question?
Thank you. So something that's remarkable in science and technology museums is how there's been a wave of women directors hired within the last year. I'm thinking New York Botanical Garden and Air and Space Smithsonian are now going to be led by women. So could you speak, and natural history is run by a woman as well. So could you speak a little bit to why
Because it's so much more about money. Like, sadly, art has become a plaything of the wealthy. And anytime it's all about money and capitalism, the patriarchy wins.
We have to make fun of it. You have to ridicule it. Shame, humiliation, and ridicule are really important tools in your toolbox. Anyway, thank you so much. This has been a great crowd, and I just can't believe that you've been so patient to get a seat, to sit here, and then you stayed for all these questions. Maybe we should come back more often.
Very inspired and inspiring, I think, presentation. And as a thank you to the Guerrilla Girls for coming to FIT, we have a gift for each of you. These are pendants. They're circles of silver with cracked glass in the pendant. The glass ceiling is still intact, unfortunately, but thanks to the Guerrilla Girls, there are a few more cracks in it. So these necklaces recognize the work that
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight.
See you again, New York. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll come backstage.